you're not necessarily removing the human aspect, but you're less reliant on it. And that's where, from a national security perspective, things get really interesting. It's the speed at which attackers can move, penetrate, infiltrate, and then start to manipulate your environment. From a cyber security and cyber warfare perspective, multi-vector refers to being able to overwhelm your enemy, or overwhelm your target, so to speak. So that's where autonomous cyber warfare really kicks in. We've talked a lot about crafting exploits, we've talked about breaching systems, we've talked a little bit about the speed at which these things can occur. Vectors represent the different shapes or angles at which you can find yourselves up against an adversarial attack. You've got kind of that physical security and you've got the cyber security. The two put together is really about how do we create this autonomous perimeter that allows us to check all actions and all parts of the conflict environment. So we want to create AI agents that can support decision-making for commanders. We want to create bots that can see through the chaos, that can coherently see through the situational awareness as well, and create options for commanders at a faster and a more sound way.
Welcome to the AI Adoption Podcast. I'm your host, Professor Ashley Braganza, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Sumeet Bhatia from Cisco to this episode. Sumeet, before we get started, may I ask you to introduce yourself and also a little bit about Cisco, please?
Absolutely. Ashley, thanks for having me on your podcast. Hugely excited to spend the next hour or so talking. Sumeet Bhatia, I'm a business development lead at Cisco Systems. Cisco are a very large networking enterprise organization, but we do an awful lot more than just networking. I work for the UK and I sales teams, and in particular, I focus on innovation. And that really talks to helping our customers understand what it is that they can do with our technology and prove some of the technological proof points, as well as some of the value that the customers can derive from that. And in doing so, give them a huge amount of confidence in our solutions.
Thank you. I guess before we get started, Sumeet, I should make the point to our listeners that as you are speaking today, it's based on your expertise and your knowledge. This is not representing the views of Cisco, and you're certainly not speaking on behalf of Cisco or its policies. So I thought I should say that and get that out of the way before we kind of get started, because the areas that we're going to be talking about is around defense and security. And I just wonder if you could just kind of give us a flavor, give us a feel for how the UK can benefit from AI technologies in terms of defense and security.
Great question, Ashley. And I'll also add at the top of this that I'm a Brunel alumni. I did my undergrad and postgrad from Brunel University, so I'm a huge fan of the university as well. Great question, right? We're seeing that there's a huge change in the way AI is now being utilized. We're seeing that there are massive improvements that are coming about as a result of the use of AI in threat detection in particular. And one of the things that we are looking at, not just at Cisco, but the industry as a whole, is how network traffic and that huge scale of traffic can start to spot anomalies. Typical anomalies that humans can't detect, I would say, and also from that, then be able to predict attacks that are coming down the line. So actually, it's not just predictability across the network landscape, but it's how they self-heal in the ability to then push out intrusion, isolate those attacks, reconfiguring of systems to try and prevent further attacks inbound, and also after ejecting attackers, which you can do automatically, how does it then flag human intervention to bring value back into the moment?
In terms of that capability, what does it take to kind of develop that kind of capability? What are some of the challenges that are faced when developing that?
So through this podcast, I might pepper it with a little bit of Cisco, and that's by way of offering a real world example. There are a myriad of other technology providers doing fairly similar things, but I think we're rather unique, so forgive me if I do that. But a lot of that is dependent on how you respond to patching and rapid response. So AI can automate a lot of the type of standard technology that you put in place today that's done by humans. That's also done at a millisecond level. So you're reducing the time it takes for a surface attack to dramatically propagate its way through a network. You want to enhance physical security and surveillance as well. So a lot of AI today is based on the ability to do observational, what we call observational behavior and analysis, checkpoints, and then provide or stand up what we call perimeters for defense capabilities. So, an example of which would be Cisco, which we have a product here called Hypershield. It's a security architecture. It's very much built from the ground up and focusing around AI. So there's a lot of dependency on how the data center and the cloud environments work together to offer that degree of protection. And in doing so, it's done at the application, the device level, as well as integrity around data and where that data is coming from and to. So when you start to examine the multitude of parameters, you can start to build up this wonderful picture of how the network's performing, how the data is streaming across that network, who's accessing that data, how is it being utilized, and then how is it being fed back in again. So in essence, you've got a degree of physical security and surveillance across the network, as well as the opportunity to look at how operational enhancements and decision support systems can be used. And that's where AI really adds a tremendous amount of value. If you typically see an environment in a network where you've got improved situational awareness, faster decision-making through the use of AI and bots, and the ability to sense any chaotic behavior that's coming down the line, especially in those types of environments, you're more effectively positioned to be able to combat some of those risks.
So you've used the term AI a few times already. So let me just understand now, when you talk about AI, how are you defining AI in the context of the service, but also in the context of defense and security in this particular context?
Amazing. So AI, artificial intelligence, in terms of the use of algorithms, intelligent algorithms, bots. Typically, people see it in the newspapers as bots, and the ability to offer a service up through the network. Recipients of those bots may take data, handle them in different ways, pass them on to different bots that can automate activities, automate what we call transactions. That's one way of looking at artificial intelligence. The other way of looking at it is also how it's baked into defense from a continuous observability perspective. It's one thing having an agent or a bot do a task, come back with a response, and then kind of leave that response with you as a human. The second stage is the agentic agent, which allows it to continue to evolve decision-making as a result of the response that it's received. And that's a really, really interesting part of this whole equation, because now you're not necessarily removing the human aspect, but you're less reliant on it. And that's where, from a national security perspective, things get really interesting.
That combination of the algorithm, the bot, and the human, how does that combination work? Because increasingly people, not just in defense and security, but even in commercial organizations in the public sector, everyone's talking about AI becoming part of the team. How does that relationship work between the human and the bot, as we're using that phrase now?
So what we want to do is understand how quickly an AI application or bot can achieve an outcome, and then how quickly a human can do that. Clearly, there's going to be a mismatch in speed, and that's where we start to see the real lethality, if you like, of cyber attacks. And that's where flash wars become not necessarily something that's happening today, but very much something we can envisage happening in the future. It's the speed at which attackers can move, penetrate, infiltrate, and then start to manipulate your environment that we start to find ourselves more reliant on the support of these AI tools, bots, devices. And so what happens is we've got a concept in the defense world around defensive asymmetry. And that is, attackers only need one vulnerability, whereas defenders have to almost protect everything within their landscape and do so in a very dramatic way, because that attack surface, as I say, it just takes one element to penetrate and you're significantly vulnerable already. So to that end, the use of intelligent bots and the likes of agentic AI allows you to really hone in, if you like, on the ability to manage that vulnerability from a supply chain perspective. And there are other elements as well as we start to look at national defense. I mean, poisoning of data, that AI-human interface is going to be key there. And I suspect in a minute we'll probably start talking a little bit about the human and the AI trust and de-skilling factor as well that kicks into place. So it's hugely important that we understand that as individuals, as humans, as operators, we need to make sure that we're not overly reliant on AI, but we need to be able to have critical judgment calls that come into play. And that's where we talk about human at the point of lethality, where there has to be a human intervention point prior to enabling the automation of a bot to do so. And that's interesting because that becomes quite an interesting granular discussion around AI failures and or manipulations that can occur adversarially as well.
It's interesting that you talk about, the poisoning of data. I mean, you can begin to see that as these AI agents are pulling in the data and learning from that data, that it may well be they may well be very susceptible to being poisoned. How does one prevent that?
That's great. So data poisoning itself can occur at any stage, and that's what makes it quite lethal. Training data can have what we call zero-day attacks built into them, where you think the training data is fine and it works really well, and then all of a sudden it just takes one small variable to change, and then that data becomes self-defeating. So it's about purity of data, but it's also about provenance. And that's where it becomes really important for us to understand what data are we using, where is it coming from, how is it being commissioned, what are those governances and checks and balances around that data. And more importantly, because there's the human element involved, we find ourselves in a potential for what we call a misinformation attack, right? Which is us not believing the data that we're seeing in front of us, although it having a sense of truth to it, or overly relying on data that isn't correct. And that corrupts our ability to then understand how we respond to those attack surfaces.
That issue about misinformation in some ways goes to the heart of that decision making, because if the information itself is not being trusted, or if we don't know whether this information is valid, correct, how does one deal with that in terms of explainability? Because at some point somebody's going to have to take a decision and then go back and maybe have to explain it. Where does explainability fit into this story?
That's a great question, and that leads very nicely onto how we understand modern AI systems today. So particularly deep learning models. So today, you'd use a typical large language model. You're essentially at the mercy of whoever's put that data into there, and you're essentially at the mercy of the ontology that constructs a framework around how that data is interrogated, utilized, and then managed, and then responded back to. One of the things we need to be very careful of, especially when we talk about national security and defense, is how those deep learning models are constructed from the ground up, its sovereignty and provenance. We need to be very careful about the decisions that AI is making off the back of that. It can be incredibly opaque. So often you see the term black box, which is utilized when we talk about how certain learning models execute their outcomes. We can't easily see how an AI agent has reached a decision. And it becomes even more compounded when you start to look at multi-agent models working together in an autonomous way, making decisions autonomously off the back of data that they receive themselves. And we can't always verify what factors an AI has used to consider when making a decision or response back. And then it's even further compounded by the fact that we can't predict how AI will behave or how an unusual adversarial condition could flare a certain situation up. So this lack of transparency becomes what we call a crisis point within the use of AI in a high-stakes environment, particularly national security. And so what military decision makers are really keen to do is to do two things. First of all, it's to understand the provenance of that data, secure it so it can't be tampered with, prevent poisoning, and then offer up what we call governance checks and balances. So the decision is based on X, Y, and Z, and that's clearly identified at the point of return. Those are just a few examples of what we can do to try and make sure that we don't misinterpret information coming back to us to make the wrong type of decision.
Yeah. On the one hand, you've got this incredible speed asymmetry, right? Because the machines, the bots can work in milliseconds, as you've already said. Humans tend to not work at that speed. So you've got one kind of differential there. You then have a second issue, which is around the data that the bot is using, and the human almost having to trust, is this misinformation, is this good information that's being used to make the decision in the first place. And then you've got this issue about at some point we're going to have to explain this stuff and why we ended up reaching this conclusion and hence this decision. Uh, Help me to get my head around this, Sumeet. How are these things brought together?
Okay, let's do this. Let's play a bit of a war game. So we are using AI in an active conflict zone.
Okay.
And, by the way, have to just be physical. We can also categorize conflict zones as cyber warfare as well.
Yeah.
So AI is making all these wonderful decisions and it's doing it too fast for humans to audit in the moment. Well, that's problematic. But at the same time, the speed is the key, where AI can act faster than humans can and certainly prevent threats. That's the key to why we'd want to use them. Will you translate that into commands driven down to commanders on the front line, for example? Why are those systems doing what they're doing? And how can you validate what they're doing if you can't base that on decisions around lethality or strategic decisions or troop deployment, for example? And then you then compounded with the explainability issues, you quite rightly say, which is, well, who's accounting for those types of decisions and how are they being made? What's the track and trace rationale in this case? And can I trust the information that's coming to me as a frontline commander, for example? And that's where the whole concept of black box models is designed to erode trust. And that's where we become susceptible to over trusting things that are coming to us or even under trusting them and second guessing. So to combat some of this in terms of the explainability crisis we've been talking about, it's really important that there are succinct, logical audit trails put in place. And they don't have to be necessarily very complicated. What they have to do is show that decisions that are being generated by AI are decisions generated by AI based on X, Y, and Z. It should then be it should be complemented with human-based decision capabilities that explains whether options A, B, and C are correct, which one should be chosen, probability analysis, all of these things. And so ultimately, what we're doing is we're trying to create an audit trail that shows us the traceability of how decisions are formed along the way. Now, you've got to bear in mind that in conflict zones where speed is of the essence, these things cannot be protracted or drawn out. So actually, there are scales that we're looking to design and implement that allow us to understand the validity of those decisions coming out. And they're pseudo-based on trust, on provenance, on the quality of the data that's being utilized, and on how much trust is being put into AI. So you'll see these trust factor scores that will eventually start to emerge when we talk about how much of that data is AI driven, how much of it would then require human intelligence. But you're quite right, the speed is the key here. Now, the reverse is true for everything that we've been talking about. I know we've been talking about it in and out of the serial perspective, but when we start to talk about defense, the same can be applied, where we can utilize AI agents and bots to look at adapting malware, to look at real-time strategy changes on the environment, instantaneous exploitation of zero-day attacks, instantaneous exploitation of simulation modeling, to say, this doesn't quite look right to me, let's flag it up. And immediately you've then got a human operator in the position to be able to make a decision, a go, no-go decision, for example. And I think that's really key as well. So I know we're painting a doomsday picture, if you like, but for everything we've talked about, the opposite is true in terms of how we respond to and use AI from a defensive perspective.
Yes, and I mean the difference between when the UK has to defend itself is clearly very different to when it has to there is an attack or there's something which is on the offensive going on, and I think that's a very important distinction to make, which you've done very clearly. So if we're back on that defensive front, then in terms of detecting threats, how can this technology be used there?
So the beauty of AI in both physical and cyber warfare is the fact that you've got what we call the amplification effect, right? So using AI, we can detect scale a lot quicker, speed, stealth, sophistication of attacks. The idea is that we are simultaneously trying to erode the effectiveness of traditional warfare, if you like, for want of a better phrase. And that's where AI supports the whole cyber defense mechanism. We've got veracity of attacks, scale of attacks, automation of attacks, and let's be honest, when it comes to AI, we can be, as humans, overwhelmed by the sheer a number of attacks that can occur, especially once you're through, threat surface then becomes exponentially bigger.
Yeah.
So the idea is that what we want to do is try and create an autonomous defense as part of that process. Multi-vector infrastructure attacks now are essentially going to be the norm, because we're not now in an environment where you're going to see an attack on one vector. You're going to see it coming through on multiple different fronts. I don't want to talk about any specific examples, but we see this a lot. Doomsday movies, for example, where the water and power and finance are all being hit at the same time, and that simply overwhelms. We can use AI to try and recognize those behavior patterns early on, create predictive modelings to say we need to secure X, Y, and Z infrastructure before it gets any worse or before it's even attacked. And that's important, because at the end of the day, these tools and these devices can be used to try and maintain what we have in play today, rather than allow adversarial behavior to try and destroy that.
Sumeet, you've used a term that I've not come across, which is a multi-vector attack. In layman's terms, could you just explain a multi-vector attack? What does that phrase mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's basically being bombarded on a number of fronts. Now, in the physical world, I mentioned, it could be our critical national infrastructure, so water, power grids, data grids, telecoms. These are all very susceptible environments, especially to adversarial attacks. And our enemies know that downing any one of those could then lead to a prolonged and unsustainable engagement. From a cyber security and cyber warfare perspective, multi-vector refers to being able to overwhelm your enemy, or overwhelm your target, so to speak. So that's where autonomous cyber warfare really kicks in. We've talked a lot about crafting exploits, we've talked about breaching systems, we've talked a little bit about the speed at which these things can occur. Vectors represent the different shapes or angles at which you can find yourselves up against an adversarial attack. So deep fakes, for example, and information warfare. Now, how does a general believe that the information they're getting over radio or audio or video or the command structure is the information they should be responding to? What that does, any fake information that's fed into the system via AI can then go on to destabilize operational activity on the front line. And we talk about this from a military deception perspective, but actually these are highly sophisticated, micro-targeted disinformation campaigns. And we are starting to see that emerging in the real world today. We talked about critical infrastructure. The other one you might want to think about is what we call AI-enhanced intelligence gathering attacks. So the open source intelligence infrastructure, OSINT, is very much something that an AI tool can gather large-scale information around, scraping away at different sources, analyzing publicly available information, especially around military assets nowadays, and then start to gather and garner that information and extrapolate and work out vulnerabilities that might exist. We're talking about, groups of people who are using hyper-personalized, phishing exercises to try and deceive frontline military staff. And then we've talked a little bit about targeting defensive systems as well, especially those systems that rely heavily on being in an online cloud environment, because they've got to talk to a multitude of different in-region threat neutralizing agents. And then, of course, swarm attacks, which is, again, you go back to the whole concept of speed. And that's where you're looking at, lethal autonomous weapon systems that can be infiltrated on the battleground, and decisions can be autonomously put into place to target the wrong systems, for example, or to recognize a non-threat as a lethal threat. And then those are the types of scenarios where we start to see real battlefield disruption. So, multi-vector refers to, in the real world and the cyber world, as just the different panes of glass through which you can create disruption and anarchy.
Fascinating world, and which is why I wanted you on here. Because it seems to me that, with all this going on, it reminds me of an incident that happened and was quite widely reported, where a department, I think it was based in Hong Kong, received a call that was, for all intents and purposes, was a very senior member of that organization, but based in London, issuing an instruction over a Teams call to say they wanted some money to be transferred to a bank account, and the subsidiary in Hong Kong actually transferred that money. In fact, there were 2 or 3 payments that were made. And then it transpired that the senior manager or the senior person in the UK, that was entirely a fake. The voice had been cloned, the facial aspects had been cloned. And so, you know, I hadn't made the parallel of doing something like that on a battlefield or in a war zone environment. But you can see that if that's possible to happen, that could cause real chaos.
Absolutely. And don't forget, chaos in itself is a great wartime strategy. I know it sounds a bit 1980s, but disinformation is one of the biggest problems we feel.
Yes.
It's hit us from an execution perspective. On the ground, in the moment, commanders, soldiers, military personnel, even operational personnel need to really think twice about what they're doing, where they're getting that data points from. Now, it's interesting because traditionally, the data points we used to get in used to be fairly lateral data points. Systems were set up to be very simple for a reason, so that they could be easily and quickly interpreted. And there's a whole set of standard operating procedure around that. But if you look today, in some of the conflict zones, and I don't want to get too specific, you'll see that there are soldiers using Google Maps, Google Earth. There are military campaigns taking place using, publicly available information that sits on the cloud. Famously, we see that Starlink is one of the sources that's being used and stood up to support the campaigns that are currently in place, actively in place in theatres in the European theatre. And as a result, there's an opportunity for someone somewhere to penetrate those networks, to penetrate that environment and to cause chaos. And so, yeah, very, very important that you recognize that we're moving, and your audience as well, that we're moving away from linear lateral comms. We're starting to use rich media, video, voice, and the ability to authenticate and validate and authorize action based on those media sources. It's now very much the norm within, unfortunately, within conflict zones.
Yeah, and I guess when you talk about a conflict zone, then really what happens on the ground is really critical. In terms of operational enhancements, how might some of these technologies be used then in terms of improving, enhancing what is happening on the ground?
Yeah, that's a great question. And ultimately, like I was saying before, everything I'm painting the doomsday scenario for can be reversed. What we want to do is we want to create AI agents that can support decision making for commanders. We want to create bots that can see through the chaos, that can coherently see through the situational awareness as well, and create options for commanders at a faster and more sound way. For that, we're really focusing now on how we can use AI from a logistics optimization perspective. And you'll hear a lot about logistics optimization. It's a commercial term, a corporate term that you hear a lot about, but actually conflict zones are very much like the traditional conveyor belt style business, right? You've got to supply one end, you've got to predict what's happening, you've got to maintain as you're going along, and then you've got to prioritize, just like you would do in a commercial environment. So what does that smart supply chain look like? How do we create a predictive maintenance, whether it's tanks that we know that are going to break down because they're being overstretched, whether it's supply lines that could potentially be penetrated and that would slow down a conflict in one particular area or conflict field zone. And how do we then prioritize the deployment of operational activity? Well, AI can help you do that because it can suddenly scour, see, and start to understand all the data points coming in and almost create like a simulation version of what could happen. It's the whole could, would, or should scenario. And of course, if you can then start to put some intelligence around that, finding optimal routes through a battlefield, identifying bottlenecks that might occur, is a network penetration going to set you back on the front line? And that's how we're starting to see a very interesting dynamics between frontline warfare and kind of cyber support and operational attacks that are going on. So now you're seeing you're seeing battle in theaters occurring on two fronts, not just the traditional one kind of physical front, but the cyber front as well. And how do you then dynamically relocate those resources to support that, whether that be, cyber resources, operational resources. And so that's where AI can actually help, because now we're starting to get what we call a friendly help up, something that can help autonomously provide some of that physical and cyber operational presence and patrol those environments. And for us, and we're starting to see this emerging as well, which is optimizing response times as well. So what does a crisis response modeling look like? If there's a systemic failure occurring in this part of the conflict zone, how can we underpin and support that to keep it propped up as well? So like I said to you, you've got kind of that physical security and you've got the cyber security. The two put together is really about how do we create this autonomous perimeter that allows us to check all actions and all parts of the conflict environment.
Sumeet, thank you for that really comprehensive answer. And it's really interesting that you should kind of make the analogy with the things that are going on in the private sector. And really, one of the questions I did have for you was, are there lessons that the private sector can learn from some of the thinking that's going on in the defense and security sector?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where you're going to get a little bit of a flavor from the Cisco in me coming out, which is we've talked a lot about prevention and detection and monitoring. For us, we have a solution called AI Defense, which continuously looks at your environment. It models third parties. It actually also looks at third-party AI tools as well. And it checks that traffic on the network. It really helps to create what we call guardrails. And I suspect we're going to get onto a bit of a policy discussion towards the end of this call as well. But those guardrails are really, really important because they protect the current environment and they also serve as guidelines for how to deal with adversarial inbound actions as well. So from a network and a commercial perspective, an environmental perspective, we've got AI Defense that does a lot of that stuff. We've got XDR, which is our version of extended detect and response. And the idea is it's almost like your agent that's looking at your environment and finding those bad actors and kind of kicking them out and keeping them out as well. Don't forget that's on-prem and in the cloud as well. So we're now protecting physical and cloud assets as well, which I think is really, really important. And we talked a little bit about those two differentials within kind of conflict zones as well. And so for us, it's like, how do we those are the types of tools that gives you that instant attacker verification profile. And that's the key there as well. Things like zero trust, which we're starting to see propagate its way through standard network environments. That's really, really important. Zero trust acts as a checks and balances to make sure that the right people are accessing your network at the right time. And that if they have access, they have the right type of access or the very specific type of access so that you don't need to necessarily check through what they're doing wholeheartedly. You don't have to have that kind of bouncer standing over their shoulder. These are all concepts that will apply both within a civilian and a military environment as well. In terms of the AI revolution that we're starting to see within an infrastructure and a network environment, you yourself can see that the more AI tools that are being propagated every day, the more they're being used, the more that they are being consumed, the more checks and balances you're going to need to make sure that there aren't any loopholes. And so that's where a lot of our technology sits across your network to keep those guardrails in place. And I think the key thing there is certainly guardrails. But yeah, can you deal with that at speed? Can you deal with those cybersecurity threats and the evolving attack landscape? What's your threat detection and orchestration policy? How does that all play together to help from an operational enhancement perspective? As you can see, we've talked a lot about these things systematically through this podcast, right? Yeah. Well, you need to be able to control all of that within a single unified environment.
Great. And you mentioned policy a little earlier, and you're right. I mean, what are some of the policies that the government should be considering in terms of AI in the defense and security area?
That's a great question because we consider policy in two very different ways. Not to overgeneralize, but clearly when we're talking about national defense and security and conflict, it isn't very different. I think very proud to say that the UK must and is looking to redesign its defense governance. We're seeing there's a lot happening and it's available online as well. But we want to be able to operate safely the types of technology with accountability and resilience. I think the ethical safeguards are very important as well, because it's not necessarily the kind of destruction we might be able to do outbound, but it's how well we can protect and secure what we have today. And I think when we talk about lethality and our own citizenship, we need to be very, very careful there. So what we are doing here in the UK is looking to see how we can redesign the defence governance, in particular around how we operate this machinery safely, at speed and with accountability. Clearly, we're keen to have resilience in this space, but there are those ethical safeguards involved as well. And what do I mean by that? Well, mandatory human in the loop for lethal decisions, for example. We have to have humans in the loop for life or death actions. There needs to be clear rules of engagement, especially when it comes to the human AI teaming. And we haven't talked about that fully, but that's a very, very, very interesting space that will find itself emerging in the next few years, which is how do human AI teaming work, and what are those key sweet spots to enabling success in that space. There needs to be legal accountability for any of those types of decisions, especially lethal ones. And I think that's where we need to be very compliant with international human rights laws, as well as our UK law as well. But from a governance perspective, though, I think it's really key that we find ourselves with the types of engagements that we have that are being logged from a mandatory perspective, where we can review decision trails. You're going to hear a lot about decision trails because you hear about the provenance of data and how that's being transposed and transported between different AI solutions. Well, we need to make sure that we have sound decision trails along the way. And also independent auditing, which is a capability that I think we've spent a lot of time here in the UK, certainly focused on. So if we've got algorithmic accountability, which is what that first bit is, and then you've got auditing accountability, which is what the second bit is, I think that makes for a very powerful governance machine. The speed and the way in which different conflicts will occur will not always be in line with the types of firm policy that we can build, because there is that what we call policy technology run rate, right, which is technology outruns the policy a lot quicker. So there'll have to be something that we need to do to try and understand that landscape a little bit more, maybe create more dynamic control frameworks in terms of how we respond based on the technology that we have today. But I think here's the real kicker. How do we prepare for a quantum resistant cryptography, right? What are the policies? I've asked the question on the podcast. I'm not sure I've got all of the answer to it, but I think we're going to start to see what happens when quantum resistant cryptography kicks into place and how that's going to help. And I think we need to absolutely focus on that, because all of the vulnerabilities that we've talked about that AI poses today, combination of kind of software, systems, human exploitation, human fallibility, all of that can be addressed in the quantum world, which means that we can start to think about how do we adopt that type of resistant cryptography. How does quantum help prioritize critical national infrastructure and decision making around that? And how does quantum help coordinate a lot of the stuff that we've spoken about up top on this podcast?
I mean, that's a massive area, but you can begin to see that is going to play out. And as these technologies come together and start to become interconnected and start to converge, I think there is going to be a significant amount of change that just these technologies and their convergence is going to drive. You mentioned the issue of AI and human teaming. Give me your insights into how you think that might play out.
How fast can you use ChatGPT, right? At a very rudimentary level, it's you plugging information into, in this case, a large language model. From my perspective, and from what I'm starting to see emerging, is this ability to become one with the machine. And actually, we've seen a lot of this already, right? We've seen this with the way we've got drone operators that are sitting, far away from conflict zones, operating drones in the moment, real time. Okay. Very sophisticated equipment that they're sitting around, almost as if they're in the moment and flying the drone themselves, which they are, but not there and then. And so what we want to do is we want to create a parody. So when we talk about AI teaming, human AI teaming, it's how do we create an environment in which you're getting inbound information live from not one, not two, maybe hundreds of different bots, all going away, specializing in certain things, sharing information, creating autonomous decision-making, and then reporting it back to you. And then how do you respond to that information? And this is where the human element really does kick in. It's how do we start to train people to work with AI tools? Is this about speed? Is this about understanding? Is this about a broader contextual awareness? What does the AI human team of the future look like? And what elements do we need to train the human on to give them the advantage to work more effectively with the inbound AI elements that are coming through? That's hugely interesting. And actually, what we're seeing is a de-skilling occurring because of how proficient and how efficient AI can be, that we're finding ourselves having to do less and less of the thinking. Well, actually, one could argue that in an environment where you've got an awful lot of data coming into you, it's not so much thinking that needs to occur long term, but it's in the moment decision making that becomes critical and key. And so how do we then start to change people and humans and train them to be able to cope with that? And the coping mechanism around that is another fascinating area, which is at the moment, we're all exposed to different types of AI. We're getting the privilege of being able to be chosen to be interacting 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. Well, what happens when you've got 400 operating in the background? Who then comes to the surface with the type of information that you need to be able to make a critical decision on? These are very overwhelming elements that need to be thought of and discussed. And I think there needs to be an awful lot of planning and training and skill development around this.
Sumeet, this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. And you've opened my eyes certainly to a whole range of issues that I'd not even begun to think about, I have to say, because it's in the area of defense and cyber. Let me just say a huge thank you for joining me on the AI Adoption Podcast. And I really appreciate you giving your time and your insights.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute joy. Appreciate it.